Hello everyone, I'm Stefan Gevers and welcome to my studio. I am going to do a couple of little demonstrations and explanations about questions that students have asked me to explain. The first one is, how do you control the water in your brush? Sometimes you do have to use a lot of water, like for example in one of my works where you have these areas. I on purpose add a lot of water in those areas so they will create those lovely edges. Here's another example, and all you can see basically on this painting is water. So for some paintings I really use a lot of water because that's the purpose of what I would like to paint. Other things though, if you're working on smaller samples, for example, like little still lifes, you would really need to control the amount of water in your brush. Otherwise it just flows everywhere. Once the paint sits on paper and it's really wet, it can do anything at once, and the pigments tend to flow to the outer edges, for example, like that one there. And you get a lovely transparent shape, but you don't have the shading that you sometimes are after. So I don't always do landscapes. I have done other things as well in the past. And here's a good example of which I've used a combination of working quite wet, but also working with lots of brush control and controlling the water in my brush. I don't know if you can see it, but you can see some really wet patches, but also some really soft tonal areas that you can only create by controlling the amount of water that you add on paper. So I teach my students usually this technique by creating a simple grid of rectangles or squares, and then we make a color in our palette. So I start with my palette. I much rather use a palette with wells because I can create, and I'm using a cobalt blue for this exercise now, I can create a puddle. Even with 3 drops of water, I've got a puddle, which is really important. Let's say I'm doing the same with a flat surface. So if you work with a flat surface palette or a plate, it's a lot more difficult for you to create a puddle. So I'm even dropping in another drop. So I have 2 areas of paint. This is a puddle, and I can scoop my paint up and my brush is loaded with paint. Or I can use this flat surface and I scoop it up, but my brush is probably half full with this paint. Yeah, and then I teach my students to apply the paint on water, and as soon as you apply the paint on your paper, you need to observe how much is on there. This is pretty good. But let's say you've applied this much, you need to learn to recognize that that's too much. So how do you control that? What I do is I basically use my towel, and your towel will get dirty, and I mop up the excess paint. Until I think, yes, this is exactly the right amount, I can work with that. See, that is pretty good. Then you rinse your brush, and then you have to add water. And the amount of water you add, you control by scraping it off on your bowl or touch on your towel. I usually go like that, and as soon as I apply my water on paper, I have a pretty good idea if I have enough or not. So I need to pick up a little bit more, so I just dip in my brush and I start here again. And in that way I have the right consistency, the same consistency of the paint that I put on, as well as the water that I applied on the paper there. And when those consistencies are the same, the pigments blend beautifully, evenly in that surface. try to use a tea towel, not a hand towel or a paper towel. Paper towel is fine, but it absorbs a lot of water. A tea towel is perfect. It's like your little friend. You get to know your tea towel really well, and you know exactly, like if you press it hard or soft, how much water your tea towel will absorb. Even the setup of your desk, the way I've positioned my pots of water, my palette, my towel and my scrap paper is always the same. So I can pretty much do it with my eyes closed, and this movement here is a constant movement. From mixing, testing, applying, rinsing, adding water, scraping it off. Control the amount of water, or add a little bit more. Mixing a new color, let's make it into a green. Testing it, more yellow. Applying it on the paper. Not enough, add some more. Add some water, look and feel the brush, scrape it off. Rinse your brush, clean water, new puddle, etc. It's this movement that is quite constant, and the more you paint, the easier it will get. So I'm going to demonstrate a little row of hills and have a look at the way I'm using my brush, hopping from one pot to the other, using my tea towel, testing my paper. So I'm going to do a little wet and wet wash in a row of hills. Have a look at my brush handling. So I'm applying the paint, and the paint is right, it's not too wet, not too dry. I rinse my brush, clean water, I scrape that water, and I start with my water around here, but it is too wet. Touch on a towel, now it's right. And you can see the pigments flowing. I'm using another color and I'm dropping that in a little bit here. And I'm continuing there. Brush size is also very important. If your brush is too big, you struggle. Rinse my brush in my dirty pot. Pick up some clean water, scrape that water because I want more precision. It's too wet. I'm applying the water a little bit further. Now I'm happy with this shine. And I blend them together. Picking up some of the blue, I'm scraping it off because I only want a little bit, and I drop some of that blue and I paint it through those areas. Working with water, clean my brush, touch more because my area is getting smaller, and perhaps I should move into using a smaller brush. Some more of the purple, scrape it off, drop it in, and I've got my row of hills. So to make my students understand how it works, I usually apply a little flat wash like that, because if you do understand why things happen, you are then able to find a solution to fix the problem. So I've created a flat wash, and it is dark. Really observe what's happening when I drop in a drop of water and what happens to the pigments. You can see that the water pushes all the pigments towards the edge. The pigments are trying to find the driest edge. They're being pushed away. So therefore you are creating these shapes. And when you work with too much water, that will happen on paper as well, and the water pushes the pigments to the nearest driest edge. If your surface is consistently and evenly wet, you end up with a lovely even gradient surface, if that is what you're after. So, just talking about controlling your water in your brush, I've painted for over 30 years, and really that is the most difficult part, to control that water that you apply on paper. Try to get it exactly right. It's the most challenging part of watercolor. Good luck!